All right, so thank you very much all for coming. Thanks for the organizers for including our paper in the program of the conference. And this is a joint work with Mariassunta Giannetti, Loumioti, and Caterina Mendicino. Caterina works at the European Central Bank, so the usual disclaimer applies. All right, so in the past couple of years, we have seen banks increasingly emphasizing their environmental activities in their investor reports or in communication in their voluntary disclosures. We know from the corporate finance literature that this is oftentimes associated with a number of benefits. For example, things like better ESG rating, more loyal customer base, or potentially lower cost of capital. At the same time, we have also seen a rising skepticism, specifically by the policymakers or the public commentators, essentially voicing out a doubt to what extent these environmental disclosures are meaningful, or whether they only contain unsubstantiated claims that only symbolically comply with these new rising institutional demands. So what we want to do in this project is that we want to answer the question heads on. And specifically, we ask, what is the relationship between the environmental disclosures of banks and their actual bank lending activities? And in the paper, we proceed in two steps. The first one is that we conduct a text analysis of these voluntary disclosures of banks. Specifically, following up the rising use of large language models, we use the ChatGPT to help us understand the sustainability of lending policies in the annual and sustainability reports of banks. And then secondly, we study the relationship between these environmental disclosures and bank lending to firms. Now, if you worked in this field, you know that understanding which loan is brown is actually really challenging. So what we do in the paper is that we try to propose 3 different separate ways to capture the brownness of the loan. Each of them comes with a number of trade-offs. So specifically, we look into lending to firms in brown versus green industries. Then for a subset of firms, we observe the firm-level greenhouse gas emissions. And then finally, we conduct additional text analysis using Capital IQ description of the businesses, and we match it with the EU taxonomy to get elicited information whether this business is described as green. So let's talk about the key findings of the project. So specifically, we focus on this relationship between what banks say in their disclosures and what they do in terms of their lending portfolio. And we find a couple of things. So the first thing is on the loan level, we observe that banks that disclose more about an environment actually end up disproportionately lending more to high emission borrowers. We don't find that this is being offset by banks charging neither higher interest rates nor shortening the maturity on these loans. Once you aggregate these results at the bank level portfolio amount and a level, you find that overall these results persist. So banks that disclose more about their sustainability policies actually end up having their loan portfolio skewing more towards brown industries and away from green industries. So then in the paper, we proceed and try to understand the mechanism that can help us shed light on this puzzling effect. The first potential story that we explore is that there could be nothing wrong with funding brown businesses, because what the banks can be doing is they can be funding their transition towards adopting green technologies. I'll talk about it later, but we employ a couple of tests to get into the heart of this problem, but we don't find any evidence that there is a green funding transition of the green technologies going on. Instead, what we find is that banks tend to disproportionately lend more to existing borrowers, so the relationship between a bank and the firm matters, especially if these firms are financially underperforming. So overall in the paper, we argue that banks tend to overemphasize their sustainability goals while continuing the relationship with their existing borrowers. All right, so exactly as, I'm an economist, so I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the data and the methodology of our paper. So the key data that we use in this paper comes from the credit registry of the European System of Central Banks. So this is the ANA credit, which is a confidential data on all loans to businesses above the 25,000 reporting threshold. And these are the commercial loans outstanding to the non-financial sector. We observe a number of characteristics. Most importantly, we're going to today talk about loan amounts, but we also see interest rates, maturities, etc. And for the purpose of this project, we zoom into the period of 2014 up to 2020, and specifically we study the newly issued loans, so the new credit that the banks are granting in line with their environmental disclosures. Now, I already alluded to this in the introduction, but one key thing is how do we measure the brownness of this loan? So there are essentially 3 ways that we propose in the paper that are hopefully complementary to one another. The first way allows us to use the entire richness of this loan level credit registry data, including the very, very small firms. And for that reason, we observe for every firm their particular industry and country to which it belongs. So we are able to match that with the industry level greenhouse gas emission data from Eurostat that essentially attributes to each firm its industry classification. And then we can say whether this firm belongs to the high polluting industry in that country in that specific year or not. Now, this can come at a couple of caveats. Potentially, one problem is that there's a big heterogeneity within the same industries, and two firms can be very different. For that purpose, we use Urgentum data that are bringing us the firm-level greenhouse gas emissions. So here we can really distinguish, and specifically, we're looking into Scope 1 and Scope 2 emission intensities. The problem with this approach is that even though we observe the emissions very precisely, we only see them for the larger borrowers. So finally, as a middle ground, we perform a text analysis using the Capital IQ business description. And essentially, we try to understand whether the business description that the analysts put into the Capital IQ characterize the firm as brown or green. So you can imagine textile industries, and you can have 2 firms. One is described as more of an upcycling sustainable fashion. The other is just like a regular textile firm. So that can open up additional heterogeneity going to a larger sample. And this is going to allow us to observe approximately 150,000 both public and private firms. And then just regular data that one might normally see, balance sheet of banks, firms, etc. So let's talk about disclosures. If we were to write this project in the US, our job would be much simpler. We would go to EDGAR, download all of the reports in the same place, and start processing. There's no EDGAR in Europe. So if you go website by website of every major bank in Europe, you hope everything is written in English, you download it all, and you start processing. So we start with roughly 1,400 documents, approximately half of which are annual reports, and the second half is a mixed bag of sustainability reports, integrated reports, non-financial reports, etc. So now that we have it, we start actually processing this data. In the newest version of the paper that I'm presenting here, we use a large language model, specifically ChatGPT, to help us parse this information. If you've ever worked with ChatGPT interface of like big data, via Python, you might know that there's a limit on tokens, or in other words, on the number of words that the ChatGPT can process. In other words, we split the annual report into paragraphs, and we feed it paragraph by paragraph to ChatGPT. So this is what we ask the ChatGPT. Pretend you're an investor. Following text is an excerpt from a bank's annual report. That's where it goes. Based on this text only, please answer the following question. Are the bank's lending policies environmentally sustainable? There are 3 choices: yes, no, or unknown if the text contains no relevant information. So we get this rating on every single paragraph, and then we construct our key measure, which is a ratio of the number of words in the yes paragraphs denominated by the total number of words in the specific report. So now that we have these environmental disclosures, we can start playing with that. So the first thing I want to show you are some basic trends. So these are the environmental disclosures over time, which is very consistent probably with everything you've seen in other settings. So banks are disproportionately disclosing more about their sustainable activities, especially more closer to the present time. Now, in the paper, we explore additional characteristics in terms of some basic validation checks, and we find a couple of things. I'm not going to walk you through everything. There's much more in the paper. In the paper, we show that banks that participate in the voluntary disclosures end up participating in all kinds of other disclosures, such as GRI reporting. They tend to be slightly larger. Most importantly for today's talk, they tend to be also the banks that are SBTi signatories, so they do make other commitments related to climate. Related to my motivation, these are also the types of banks that do benefit from better ESG ratings, whichever key rating you would pick. And then finally, these banks are not only talking about sustainability in lending policies, but they're also sustainable in other parts, such as they are more active in the issuance of green bonds. Now, one key thing for us, which is really interesting, is that banks that disclose more about sustainability in lending policies are actually banks with ex ante more brown portfolio. So they actually have a large scope to turn green. And it's shown here on this scatter plot. So on the y-axis, you see these environmental disclosures, and on the x-axis, you see the share of the loan book that is skewed towards brown industries. And you see there is this positive relationship. So interestingly, banks that disclose more about the environment are actually starting with a browner loan book. Now, in the paper, we want to understand what happens next. And to that extent, we start by running the following regressions. I have one equation only today, and I'm going to walk you through it very quickly. So specifically, we are interested in the loan level credit that a firm F receives from bank B in ERT. This is a new credit granted that's on the left-hand side, and this firm belongs to industry I in country C. The key coefficient of interest is the one highlighted in orange, and that's an interaction of the brownness of the loan and whether the bank is or is not an environmental reporter. So I already mentioned we're going to use different measures of the brownness of the loan. I'm going to start with the industry classification. So we're going to call the loan being brown if it belongs to the top quintile of the greenhouse gas emissions across industries in the country in the specific year, and 0 otherwise. The high environmental reporter, similarly, it's going to be a dummy variable, 1 if the bank belongs to the top quintile of the environmentally reporting banks, 0 otherwise. Two things that we as econometricians might really worry about. One is potential facts correlated to the demand for credit. So we're going to control for the demand for credit in 2 separate ways. In one, we're going to use the interaction of industry, country, and time fixed effects, which is common in the banking literature. The second one is the combination of firm and time fixed effects, which is in other words telling me I'm a firm in a brown sector and I'm receiving 2 different loans. One comes from a bank that discloses a lot about sustainability and lending, the other doesn't. Are they lending to me in a different manner? That's what we're trying to identify. Finally, we control for some additional bank characteristics that I'm going to skip for today. So the key hypothesis that we want to test is that if high environmentally disclosing banks indeed practice greener or at least less brown lending policies, we should expect this coefficient beta 1 to be negative and statistically significant. So it's not negative. It goes the other direction. It's positive and statistically significant. These are the specification with a less stringent version of the fixed effects. We can move all the way to this firm time fixed effect. So I'm comparing 2 banks lending to the same firm. And then we see that the results remain positive and statistically significant. We could interpret the last coefficient as saying essentially that high environmental reporting banks tend to grant new approximately 3.3% more credit to a firm in the brown industry compared to the bank that doesn't talk all that much about the environment. Now, you might wonder how these effects change over time. So this is the same result, but now split dynamically. And if anything, you see that this issue has become worse over time. Specifically, it hasn't gone away, for example, post-Paris Agreement. Another thing you might be thinking is that, fine, maybe these banks lend disproportionately more to their very, very brown industries, but they can be offsetting it by lending a lot to the very green sectors at the same time. So we repeat this exercise, but now we dummy out the bottom quintile of industries in terms of greenhouse gas emission to get into this green potential story. What I like to see, or what I like to think that we see in these regressions are essentially a perfectly estimated 0. In other words, we don't see that banks that disclose or do not disclose about the environment to have any different lending patterns towards the greener sectors. Now, the interesting thing is, we already talked about it, is that industry can mask a number of important heterogeneities. So for this purpose, we use the firm level greenhouse gas emission intensities, which really allow us to observe emissions firm by firm. The cost of this exercise is that the sample falls, quite a bit. So we are now at less than 4,000 observations. But the key thing is that the key message remains. So you still see that high environmental reporters end up lending disproportionately more to firms with high emission intensities. Now, interestingly, if you really control to the tightest specification, the statistical power disappears, but this, if anything, is telling us that there's no difference in how banks that disclose about environmentally sustainable policies and those that don't, that there would be any difference in their lending patterns. Now, one silver lining on this very brown cloud is that we do see that these high environmental reporters are at least to some extent less likely to build new relationship with borrowers in brown industries. And that you can see in the final column in this regression table, where we see that there's a negative and statistically significant coefficient suggesting that at least when it comes to creation of the new bank firm pair, it seems that the high environmental reporters are more cautious in creating new lending relationships. However, once you aggregate everything at the bank level, the key results remain. In other words, we find that high environmental reporters extend disproportionately more credit towards brown industries, which turns their loan portfolio more brown and away from green. In other words, there's a big discrepancy between what banks say and what banks do. So the big question, I'm going to skip the additional results that we do in the paper for the purpose of this talk, and in the rest of my time, I want to talk about the channels that can help us understand this. So one potential story here could be that there's nothing wrong about lending more to brown industries, because what these banks are actually doing, they're helping these industries decarbonize. So they're helping them transition towards greener technologies. The ideal experiment you would want to run here is that you would want to observe the greenhouse gas emission at the firm level over time and see whether they decrease. We tried it, we didn't find anything. The caveat here could be that we have too short of a data period to see meaningful decrease in the greenhouse gas emissions. As a result, in the paper, we propose additional tests that can get at this problem. The first test is based on the fact that funding transition is costly, and it can mean either spending more on R&D or potentially higher investment for a firm. So we can run an exercise when we compare two firms in the same brown industries. One of them has high R&D or high investment, the other doesn't, and see whether high environmental reporters lend disproportionately differently to these firms. Now, I have little time today, so I'm just going to walk you through additional tests very briefly. The other idea that we try to use is the fact that usually it's the new entrants or the new firms that are disruptors of the old technologies. So once again, you can compare the heterogeneities within the same brown sector to small versus to old versus young firms and see whether there's a different pattern towards younger firms. Another idea is that firms themselves can make commitments in terms of building a sustainable path to decarbonization. In other words, firms can become SBTI signatories. So once again, you can compare two observationally equivalent firms. One is an SBTI signatory, the other doesn't, and see what you get. The final idea is utilizing one more time this description of the business, and you can look within the brown business, within the brown industry, do we see differences in lending to firms that are described as green, as opposed to those that are not. Now, perfect. These are the results. I'm going to just go through them very quickly because essentially what we're looking for here, if this mechanism is at work, a positive statistically significant coefficient. If anything, it goes the wrong direction or there's actually nothing. So what seems to be going on, and this is where I want to spend my last 2 minutes, is the importance of the relationship. So in the first two columns here, we proxy for the relationship with the measure of exposure. And you see that this is telling us that high environmental reporters are particularly likely to grant new credit to firms with whom they had a large exposure in the past. So it seems that the relationship between a bank and the firm really matters. Now, in columns 3 and 4, we further interact with the size of a firm, and we see that this effect is stronger for small firms. This is really important, and this is something that is one of the key contributions of this paper, and that is that most of what we know about funding transition usually comes from larger firms, syndicated lending, bond issuances, more public parts of what banks actually do. We are using confidential data that nobody can observe, not even the rating agencies. And what we see here is that even within this confidential data, the key greenwashing or the key lending towards these high polluting sectors is coming from small borrowers. And you can imagine that the small borrowers are the most opaque part of the bank balance sheet. So if there are incomplete disclosures, they are most likely to be less noticeable exactly if they are geared towards these small borrowers. Finally, in the paper, we look into the financial health of these firms, and we find that high environmental reporters especially lend to brown businesses if these firms are financially underperforming. And so you can see here that high environmental reporters would potentially, if they would not renew these loans, these firms would potentially experience the largest financial distress. So in other words, this disconnect between what banks say and what banks do is the most pronounced, especially in the firms, in the lending relationship, specifically to these financially unhealthy zombie firms. The final thing I'm going to leave you with is that if we believe that the zombie lending story is really salient, one would expect that the types of banks that are most likely to do this are undercapitalized banks. And that's exactly what you see in this final column here, when we compare the bank heterogeneities, and we find that specifically lowly capitalized banks are the most likely to engage in this behavior. So I'm out of time, so I'm just going to wrap up. In the paper, we show that banks that disclose more about their sustainability policies actually end up lending more to high-emission borrowers. We don't find any evidence that this is related to transition. Instead, we show that the relationship between the bank and the firm really matters, especially if these firms are financially unhealthy. And finally, if we think about going forward, we argue that regulating the content of bank environmental disclosures is really critical to A, increase its informativeness, but B, also limit these greenwashing practices. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Professor Jasova. So now the discussant is Professor Boris Vallée from Harvard. Again, you have 20 minutes.
All right. Well, thank you very much for asking me to discuss this paper, which relate to my own work, and I will make the connection during my discussion. I guess I just wanted to start with recognizing a fact that I think no one will question, is that greenwashing is everywhere around us. And if I may, I think it's particularly the case in the US, where there doesn't seem to be so much discipline about what. Okay, so let me repeat then that I think greenwashing is everywhere around us, and particularly so in these beautiful countries that we are currently in. And so there is tremendous need for disciplining the type of speech that firms or other agents are doing. And so I just have one example, which I think is quite striking. Last time I checked, it's pretty hard to make aviation carbon neutral these days, but Delta has been doing it since 2020, which is tremendous news to me. Then, of course, I also have to show some French examples. This is not limited to the US. So Total is oil major, the French one. And as you can see, they went as far as rebranding themselves to suggest that renewable was a big part of their business model. They don't disclose the breakdown of their revenues, but if you try to get a sense, we are talking about, at best, a few percentage of the revenue are coming from these activities. So I think this picture that they want to project is slightly misleading about what their business model is. Why should we care about greenwashing? Maybe that's you're an audience that doesn't need to hear that, but let me repeat it just in case there was any doubt that greenwashing can have bad effect. I mean, some say that there's a special place in hell for people that greenwash. That might be a bit strong, but I think what needs to be clear is that the main risk is that it delays or replaces actually meaningful actions towards the impact, towards sustainability that we are building. And I think another implication is that overall this is building mistrust towards a business and economic agent, and we know how harmful the lack of trust towards institution can be. I mean, we have plenty of evidence these days, and so both these dimensions are extremely important. Maybe in a more minor way, the greenwashing activity can itself be wasteful. I mean, think about the frustration you get when you walk in the metro and you see all these screens that are broadcasting advertising, which in itself is unpleasant. But then when this advertising is about supposedly sustainable behavior, whereas the activity itself is using energy and rare earths and all this impact. And last, I mean, maybe in its worst form, it can be fully strategic in the sense that it's not even cheap talk, is that it is intentionally hiding the fact that your own behavior is worsening, and I think there is some flavor of that in the paper of Martina. That is about greenwashing in general. What about finance? Is it particularly bad in finance? I mean, I might be biased here, but if we think that finance can play an important role in finding some solution to the current challenges, the answer is yes. So if we are serious about this literature that is looking at the role of finance in the transition, then anything that could delay or substitute with this behavior is indeed going to be very harmful. What is the case for finance to save the world? I mean, in 2 bullet points, I mean, what we know is that every human activity basically requires capital. So finance is touching everything, and just the simple principle of incorporating externalities in the capital allocation system can have large systemic impact on the scale and the scope of these activities. So there is a very basic premise underlying this claim that finance can participate to saving the world. I think, I mean, a question that is a bit more debated is whether the financial system has any legitimacy to do that. And we've seen again in the US that there is a lot of pushback on the legitimacy for financial institutions to engage on this goal. My own take is that let's not forget that the financial system is just an agent. Who are the principal? It's us, it's the household, it's individuals. And so in the extent that a large share of individuals actually care about these externalities, then that should give some legitimacy for our agents, may it be the financial system or government, to act towards that. And I know that I'm not necessarily aligned with all of my colleagues on this point. And so once you've taken that for granted, I mean, what are the actual tools that can be used in that regard? Well, there is all the divestment, exit policy, portfolio allocation tool, which this paper is about. There is impact finance, and then there is voluntary carbon and biodiversity offsets that have been a lot in the news lately. But there is a sense again that capital allocation being particularly at the core of the potential for impact, this divestment aspect is particularly important. So how do we think about the mechanisms that could allow for a large impact? As I mentioned, I have some work on bank exit policies, and I hope you appreciate the name of my co-author. This was the main reason I chose to work with him, was that obviously he had the name for the paper. So how do we think about it? Well, it's a set of necessary conditions. So for financial institution policy to have an impact, we need first that they comply with their policy, because if they don't follow what they committed to, it is unlikely to generate any effect. Then if they do so, this is not sufficient. We need that there is limited substitution into the capital so that there is no other capital provider that is immediately taking the place of this source of capital. And last, we need the targeted firm to be dependent on external capital, because look at the oil major right now, for instance, they are not particularly dependent on external capital because they generate so much cash flows. And so it is unlikely that it would have a large effect on oil and gas right now for that reason. And so the way I think about Martina's paper on our co-authors is that it is speaking to this first component, which is a necessary condition, and therefore we need to understand very well whether there is indeed compliance to the policies that the financial institution state. Okay, so what is this paper doing? So the main result is that banks that increase their emphasis on sustainability for their lending policies, they actually extend more new loans to brown firms or less or equally to green firms. Then these patterns are more pronounced for loans to small borrowers, and the literature so far has not been able to study that well these small borrowers. due to data limitation, and I think that's a nice contribution. And these facts are unlikely in terms of mechanism to be driven by quote-unquote transition lending, but are mostly consistent with greenwashing. How do the author come to this conclusion? There is two pillars to their methodology. The first one is to measure emphasis on sustainability, which is measured in an innovative way by aggregating the ChatGPT assessment of each paragraph of the investor on sustainability report. And then they also have access to this very neat data set that allows them to classify at the loan level whether the loan is brown or green, based basically on the industry or the firm emission intensity. Okay, so how do I think about this paper contribution in the literature? So my take on the literature is that one dimension that matters for commitments and policies to have an impact is their scope, in the sense that empirical evidence so far supports the view that precisely targeted policies are followed with actions. And there is two papers that look at either coal exit policy or even more narrow, mountaintop removal of coal policies that exclude this type of activities. Then there is two papers that are looking at broader type of commitment. One is looking at SBTI, so the Science-Based Target Initiative, and another one is looking at the Net Zero Bank Association thing. And whereas the first two papers are finding some effect, the two others are broadly finding limited to no effect both effect and actually following up on the commitment. And so one interpretation of the investor communication that this paper is looking at is that this might be the broadest type of policy, in the sense that it is not really well defined. It is potentially vague. And so that would be a third bullet point, which is expanding even more the scope of the commitment. And therefore, it is consistent broadly with this literature that this would be particularly ineffective if you are engaging in vague commitment. Then the question I ask is, but why should we care about disclosure and communication that are not associated with commitments? And I think maybe the author could invest a bit in clarifying that, because that might be what distinguishes them from the literature. And I thought that here maybe providing a bit of a theory of greenwashing would be helpful to clarify exactly why do we think that this type of communication could have a particular effect beyond the commitments that are relatively easy to observe. And I think if we were clearer about the audience and the exact mechanism for what are the incentives for banks to do that, that would potentially inform how we should exactly measure this emphasis on sustainability. Because I guess, I mean, I'm all for ChatGPT except for its carbon footprint. I think it's a tremendous tool, but I thought the author were maybe underusing it in the way they were building their measure, because I think these models are particularly nice when you have an holistic approach or when you ask them to behave as someone. And so if you were clear about who was exactly the target audience, you could tell to ChatGPT, okay, so you are an investor. Do you find this communication to be sincere? Try to exactly assess whether the model thinks this is cheap talk or not, and not just whether they are talking about it or not. And in that same vein, I think making it clearer exactly what this measurement methodology brings versus simpler methods such as simply counting keywords around sustainability would be helpful. And I think there is also a question about how to aggregate. And I understand the constraints that those are facing, but the way they aggregate at the bank level means that it is a relative measure of green talk. So you could be talking a lot about it, but if you're just someone that is very verbose in your reports, this is going to show up as you have a low emphasis on sustainability. And I don't know, honestly, if I should think about it in relative or absolute terms. And then I thought the author could provide a bit more transparency or a bit more information just on the heterogeneity of the time series of this emphasis. Because the identification is based on the time series, not on the cross-section. So there is a regression on the cross-section, but this is not what the identification is based on, and that is my next point. I think it would help to be a bit clearer whether the author wants to make a cross-sectional or a time series point. Because the interpretation is a bit written as if it was cross-sectional, that the banks that talk the most about it, they do more brown lending. But because there is bank fixed effect, it's the bank that increasingly talk about it are increasingly lending to brown firms, which is not the same thing. And I think it would need to be clarified and also stressed what should we care the most about? Is it the change or is it the level when we think about greenwashing? And in general, I thought the specifications were not super trivial to interpret because you have this bank fixed effect everywhere, meaning really, so you're identifying from change on change. And then one explanatory variable is for the bank to be in the top quintile of environmental reporter, which is a relative measure. And so a within bank relative variation in a relative measure was not super trivial for me to wrap my head around. Because I guess the question to me is, do we expect an absolute reduction in lending to brown firms or a relative one? What is it that matters for the planet? And so the current specifications are looking at relative effect, and I think it would help to clarify exactly what should matter. Then it's kind of my pet peeve that I don't know what is green lending personally. I think the paper does a great job at mostly focusing on brown. They also look at green. I think for better or worse, it's much easier to pin down what is bad for the planet as an economic activity than what is good. And so I'm always very cautious when I see all these green loans and green bonds and that are very prevalent in the literature. As I tell, so I teach real estate to my MBA students, and as I remind them, the most sustainable building is the one you don't build. And so there is a bit this sense that maybe we are not looking at the right outcome variable in many of these studies. Then these are just minor comments. And to conclude, so a very nice paper, a lot of work. I think it would benefit for maybe clarifying conceptually the motive and the mechanism for greenwashing. And again, I would also clarify for the empirical analysis whether we should think more of it as change or levels. And I look forward to reading the next version.
Okay, so thank you, Boris. So, Tina, so would you first like to respond to his comments?
Absolutely. Thank you, Boris, very much. This was extremely helpful. Your points are very well taken. We really appreciate it. Let me just briefly comment on a couple of things. On the greenwashing definition, conceptually, I guess the closest way we think about it is this SASB definition of greenwashing, which essentially says that greenwashing emerges when a firm tends to overemphasize the sustainable performance in one dimension while trying to cover up for other dimensions where it's potentially lacking. So I guess it's really nicely connected to the framework you gave us, like very broadly defined goals as opposed to like really targeted ones. So especially like the greenwashing is kind of more connected to these broadly defined disclosures when banks might talk a lot about, say, moving away from oil and gas while they can be doubling down on, coal and potentially other industries. And I think we can definitely elaborate on this more in the paper, but that's kind of conceptually where we're thinking about it. Selective disclosures, strategic disclosures towards some brown sectors while strategically omitting potentially other sectors where these banks can have a very large exposures. And again, the key part here is that because these are confidential data by the ECB, these exposures are generally unobservable to investors. So all the investors can essentially elicit this information in what's coming out of these disclosures. On the text analysis, I agree we can definitely play more with ChatGPT. So I just want to start by saying that ChatGPT is the newest addition to this paper. We've been using text analysis in the earlier drafts, so exactly word counting, sentiment, counting words about far future, past, excluding all of that. Our sentiment from doing that is that because all the dictionaries you develop are more subjective to the researchers, we moved towards ChatGPT, so something that we cannot control too much. And we found that all of our main results remain consistent, which I was not expecting that it would be so strong, but we can definitely bring those things back, at least in the appendix, and we can definitely ask the ChatGPT whether it can recognize the cheap talk. We never asked that question. I know that there are papers now like, can ChatGPT recognize the fat talk and papers of that type. So we could definitely experiment with that prompt and see whether it can recognize the greenwashing. I think it's a very clever idea. And then on the green lending, I agree with you. We try to stay away from there. There's one exercise that we do, but we try to focus on the brown. As you can imagine, oftentimes in the literature, the green lending is described as the lending to the low emission sectors. But these are oftentimes sectors like consulting, accounting, like that's not what we as humans think about green, but the statisticians do. So as a result, the paper really tries to go into the brown. The final thing I'm going to say on the identification, I think we should be clear in the text. The way we primarily think about it is the cross-section. First of all, the time period is quite short. And the second thing is, even those quintiles, most commonly, even though we describe them as time varying, it's mostly a time invariant measure. Some banks simply talk a lot about environment from the beginning and they just like increase the number of words, and some of them just like stay away. And one of the key differentiating factors are, for example, larger banks tend to be under more pressure to talk about environment, so they are more vocal, and potentially lowly capitalized banks are among the other ones. But yeah, we could definitely elaborate on this much better, and we can do more tests. So this is all super well taken. Thank you so much.
Okay, so thank you. So now I'd like to open up the floor for questions. Okay, so let's start with here.
Okay, excellent paper, Martina. Following up on the motives for greenwashing, I wanted to know if you guys have checked the impact on performance of the banks beyond the balance sheet, more on the P&L, looking at margins and looking at provisioning as well. Does it pay to be, doing more greenwashing or not?
Mm-hmm. So this is, you want me to collect more questions?
But more, or
we can take more and then I take them together.
Right. So I think I saw someone here. All right.
Hi, I was wondering if you know what part, because you matched the bank's disclosures to scope 1 and 2 and 3 emissions, but I was wondering what percentage, if you know what percentage was scope 3 emissions, because that might have a large effect on kind of how accurate or honest the disclosures were.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Okay, Kobe.
Hi, this is really interesting. So in terms of disclosure, the language itself, right, we can think about variation. We're thinking about really soft type of disclosure where we have general intention to reduce it by 2040, and then God knows what will happen 15 years from now. And there is very concrete disclosure. We reduced our, sponsor. So if you differentiate between this type of language, what do you have there? The soft one or like very clear factual things? what the credit rating agency, are they manipulated by that, or if they got it right to some extent? And then are there any lawsuits for breach of those, you know, clear factual disclosure?
Perfect. Maybe like try now and we can take more. I'll be quick. Provisions, super interesting point. We have not tried a bank level provisions as such. One thing, however, that does connect to the provisions part is this idea of the lending seems to be going more to financially underperforming firms. And, you know, these banks are not discontinuing this relationship. So within the zombie lending banking literature, there is this prevalent idea that one of the reasons why banks continue to lend to these financially unhealthy firms is that if they were to cut them out of credit, these firms would really fall into financial distress and they would need to realize losses on this loan portfolio. Now, what makes it more interesting here, again, we can only speculate, it's potentially an idea that because these loans are unobservable, all we know about the banks is what the banks say in the disclosures. Once they would need to recognize such losses on this brown part of the portfolio that we don't even know about as market participants, banks would need to publicly disclose not only those losses, but also the sectors in which these losses materialize. So this potentially could create additional incentive for banks to keep lending to these financially underperforming firms in brown industries. But we do have data on actually loan performance, so we could do much more there. So I think that's a nice suggestion. On the scope 1, 2, 3 emissions. So for now, we have only looked into it in terms of firm level emissions. And there we have focused only on scope 1 and 2, simply because the data availability for the scope 3 wasn't great. You can see that even in 1 and 2, we lost from like 1 million observation, we dropped to 3,000. We have not looked into a scope 3 emissions in terms of banks, because I think that's where you're going. We could definitely do that, because that could be interesting to see, like, you know, when it comes to supply chain, how does this correlate? And then on the information, hard versus soft, we tried a few things in the previous measure when we weren't using ChatGPT. So there seems to be there seem to be both going on. And again, like the key thing here is that these information are unverifiable by the investors. So even when it comes to the rating agencies can see very well what's going on in the syndicated portfolio, bond issuance, and so on. But when it comes to the actual loan book, they just need to take it at the face value, whatever the bank is saying. Even if they are using very targeted words in like the medium or short term, unless you are European Central Bank or a single supervisory mechanism, regulator, you actually don't know what's in the loan book. So it kind of keeps that open, but yeah, I agree we could open it up. On your final question on the lawsuit, I think Boris will know more probably, but there is a lawsuit in France right now when one of the banks is being brought to court by the NGOs that essentially are saying that the bank strategically lied in these voluntary disclosures and said that it's moving out of carbon even though it's not. So right now this is playing out in French courts and we are still waiting to see what's going to happen, but it would be very interesting once we actually see the verdict whether this is going to alter the way how and what banks choose to disclose in their disclosures going forward, if it really turns out that this is a crime that's punishable.
Okay, Tobias, and then afterwards you.
Looking at your high disclosure metric, how do you deal with this idea? If I'm a green bank, I say, we are Paris-aligned, 3 words. If I'm a brown bank, I say, we are not Paris-aligned, but we do the following to become Paris-aligned. So the wording is significantly larger, despite the fact that there's no greenwashing going on because they're actually accurately disclosing who they are.
Yeah, so in the current version, we're counting the paragraphs, as I mentioned. In the previous one, we were actually counting words, and we're also counting the sentiment around those words. One thing that the ChatGPT is really good at, I must say, is a lot of things that are very vague fall into this unknown category. So if I say, like, I'm just a green bank, this is not about sustainability in lending. You can be green bank for many other reasons than making green loans. So I guess, yeah, that's kind of where we are. What I will say is that our measure does correlate really well with the ESG ratings or with the SBTI signatories. So if anything, if we are picking up a noise, we are picking up the same noise that all the key rating agencies are picking up as well. But I agree that there's certainly a huge leeway. Again, one of the key takeaways of our paper is that regulating the content in which banks talk about this is really important, especially to alleviate those problems.
Just wondering what policy response you think is appropriate here, and in particular, like, should fraud standards be changed in this area, or like, how is this problem different from advertising or false advertising or things like that?
Well, that's very interesting. So I'm going to start with the first policy response that happened like early when we started this project. And when we had our first results, ECB was contemplating green risk weights based on how green the loan portfolio actually is of the bank. And so when we first presented this paper, it became obvious that banks' loan portfolios, even for the green banks, are not as green. So potentially, like, thinking even about like capital regulation is problematic if you want to incorporate something else. I guess you're asking a bigger question, and that is coming back to the lawsuit that is currently playing out in France. Like, is this a crime, or is this, is this like an advertising? I'm not a legal expert here, so I leave this on you. But essentially, my feeling here is that, is this potentially, one thing one could do is, like, look into the stock prices of these banks or look into the overall performance of these banks. We know from the other literature that, voluntary disclosures tend to lower the cost of capital, tend to bring more loyal customer base. So it could be a practice in which a bank can, disproportionately advance its standing. But again, we currently, at least like at this stage of the paper, haven't gone all that way. I'm super happy to talk about things like green deposits and lower cost of financing in the coffee break, that we have some thoughts on that. But in this current paper, we essentially are trying to say the key thing is that regulating the content of the banks, say, it seems to be important. It seems to be of first order if we ever want to come back of a discussion of like green risk weights or understanding if Europe as such wants banks to play a key role in transition. There has to be some more direct framework on how we actually think about these issues.
Mary, Jeff, and Genevieve. So,
thank you. So I'm just wondering whether the intuition, at least it explains your results, are fairly simple. Step one is banks, whatever their customer base is, tend to continue to lend to their current customers because they know them. And then B, if you happen to be lending to, if your customer base is dirty, you try to clean it up more with this kind of disclosure. It may follow up a bit on Yair's comment.
I think that's fair. I think that, yes, we do highlight that the relationship story really matters. Now, the interesting thing is that these disclosures are voluntary. So, it's kind of like the big puzzling thing that we are trying to shed the light on is that, exactly as you said, if your ex-ante portfolio was very dirty, you continue leaning that direction. But at the same time, you start disclosing about selective green activities that you're actually doing, even though on an aggregate level, your portfolio is still turning dirtier and dirtier.
Okay, so let's collect all the questions. So first, Jeff.
So thank you. Couple of things. Does ownership figure in your assessment, whether the bank is, a privately owned bank, has a big float, et cetera? I mean, differences of ownership. And then secondly, thinking about from a sort of a policy perspective, the EU is pushing towards the growth of the bond market instead of the banks, right? And so could there possibly be a selection effect in the sense that firms that can issue green bonds do it, and so what we see left in the banks are in effect brown. And so part of the reason maybe the banks increase the share of brown is given the changing nature of the public bond market to favor firms that can issue a bond that they can colorably call green.
Okay, so now, Genevieve, please.
Thank you. Perhaps following up on the heterogeneity or homogeneity of the sample, it seems that all in these Euro banks, they all speak English, or you manage to have all of them speak English. Perhaps Google Translate helps here. So there is some homogeneity, but how much is there? So in the examples you give at the end, in the appendix C, there is ENG, there is a French bank and a German bank, and I wonder whether you spotted some differences because banks have different roles in these different jurisdictions. So in terms of ownership, but also in terms of sort of how what is their role in the economy.
Yeah, no, these are very good points. So let me start with the ownership.
So can we just take one more question over there, and then I think that was the final one. Yeah, please use the microphone.
Okay, I just had two quick suggestions for triple difference or subsample. One is if you could look at which banks maybe had internal teams for sustainability. If they is personnel policy, does personnel matter more than disclosure? Another is I was struck by the discussant's comment about who is the audience for disclosure. So, I know the Eurobarometer, I mean, the public opinion in the home country, right? Or maybe does the government in the headquarter country have the Greens? I guess the Greens are never in government, but, a relatively more or less pro-green party in government. I don't know how much heterogeneity you have there, but that could be something you could look at.
Perfect. Okay, so ownership, we haven't done exactly what you mentioned, but we have it on our to-do list. So the big problem is most of our banks are privately owned, but one of the things that is on our immediate to-do list is at least differentiate between the banks that are publicly traded and the privately owned banks to see whether this dispersion of ownership could actually help us understand this heterogeneity. In terms of the EU policy, I agree with your assessment. There is actually a paper by people in Switzerland showing that exactly around the lines what you mentioned, that the issuance of green bonds tend to be more green, issuance of bonds tend to be more green, and so essentially firms choose to strategically place the bonds, the more visible part of their activities towards the bond market and potentially the less visible part towards the bank financing. I think that's probably something that's going on. Now, the key thing of ours is really to focus on these smaller firms. So like even within the firms, the SMEs that don't really utilize the bond market, we do see that this effect is actually really going on there. And these small firms actually don't have a substitution, or at least like in Europe, it's not common that they would go for the bond market financing. So they are really reliant on the banks. And again, this brings a bigger question is that if the European Commission wants banks to be these guardians in green transition, how do we envision that going forward? On the sample heterogeneity, so first of all, surprisingly, everything is in English. I guess the reason why this is going on is that these are banks whose headquarters is regulated by the single supervisory mechanism in Frankfurt. So they probably do have some regulatory requirements to at least put their annual reports and key reports in English. So that turned out not to be, thankfully, our problem. We tried playing with the heterogeneity. I personally come from Slovakia, and I have no expectations that Slovak banks would disclose differently than Finnish. So that was something that we looked at. Interestingly, we didn't find a big country variation. So also coming back to countries that have a bigger, greener policy, at least in terms of lending, we didn't find there to be too much going on. It seemed to be happening a little bit everywhere. Now, on the internal factors, personal, I think that's a great suggestion. We definitely will look into it. And then who's the audience? So currently the way we think about it is that primarily this could be both investors, but public as well. In an earlier version, we did look into different characteristics of banks that generally disclose whether they belong to the countries where, local population is more likely to participate in a lawful protest or post on social media. What's the role of social activism generally? There seems to be some correlation, but again, in terms of the broader greenwashing message, it was really coming up across the entire cross-section.
Thank you. Oh, all right. So, Ujin, I think, yeah.
Yes, just one question. So just to be fair to the banks, what happens if you leave out those small firms that are underperforming and would go bankrupt if the bank stops lending? So for the remaining sample, would you see a positive relationship between what they claim and what they do, at least?
That's an interesting question. I need to come back to our interactions and look into the parts for the larger ones. I'm not sure from the top of my head. I'm happy to come back to it. The key thing is that these are not necessarily the very smallest banks. So if you think about the bank loan book, especially in Europe, SMEs are the backbone of the European economy. So this is an extremely important part of the bank activity. So kind of in this paper, we chose to go the other direction. So rather than omitting them, to lean into this part, because if we think about syndicated lending, and much has been written about it, which is certainly extremely important, but if we think about the key activity of banks, especially if we do have rising bond markets, is the catering towards the SME sector, which is really, really important for the growth in Europe. So, and that's where we find kind of the most disturbing message.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation.